Jason Lewis.
And I'm Todd DeShida.
And I'm Thomas Mills.
Welcome to Climate Optimists. As a couple concerned citizens, we're on a journey to explore climate solutions and ways each of us can make a difference. So, while many podcasts are funded through, sponsors or ad revenue, here at Climate Optimists, we rely on listener donations to bring you the programming that you hear. So, if you're a regular and value what you get from us, consider a donation. All you have to do is head over to our website, climateoptimist.co, and click the donate button. And as Todd says, no donation is too small or too big.
I do say no donation is too big.
No, in all seriousness, even $5 a month goes a long way for us. And those monthly donations are definitely valuable because it's a steady stream of support. So our early listeners will remember that we did an episode focused on the impacts of climate change on agriculture and, what farmers are going to need to do to become more resilient. And today we've decided to focus on ag from a slightly different vantage point and dive into the emissions created by, producing our food and what can be done to reduce them. Before we go there, Todd, you made it back from your hunting excursion and no frostbite.
No frostbite, although it was cold. It was fun. It was good to unplug and get away a little bit and hang out with some friends and family and whatnot. But it's nice to be back in a little bit warmer weather here. But moving on to the reason for hope, newly elected President Gustavo Petro from Colombia is trying to move the country away from oil production, which is kind of a big move for them. And he seems to have some popular support, which is good. And wanted to quote him because I thought it was kind of a poignant quote. He said, "The opinion of power has ordered that cocaine is poison," he said, "but instead, coal and oil must be protected, even when it can extinguish all humanity."
Wow.
He sounds like a pretty well-spoken dude.
Powerful.
It's strange because Colombia, is still relatively a poor country and has probably decades more oil revenue to cash in on, and that money counts now for around a fifth of government income and a tenth of its gross domestic product. So it would be, it's no small feat to try to take something like this on. Their energy production is pretty sustainable, though. They generate about 80% of their energy from mostly hydropower. So, it's not like they're using a lot of this for, generation, but income for their country, it would be kind of a big hit. So it'll be interesting to see where this goes and see if he can be successful at kind of shutting this down.
I mean, that's, even if it isn't something that takes place right away, it's pretty massive, right? That a country that, has effectively all this kind of black gold sitting there,
Sure.
recognizes what that will mean for their future if we keep it consuming it.
Yeah, and I was really surprised too how even the people who disagreed with him in the business community were supportive of the idea and like supportive of him and his intent, and there wasn't any vitriol toward him about it. And it was just staggering to see the difference between kind of their discourse and what we've been living with for the
Right.
past, number of years here, and just the major difference in how they kind of spoke and are speaking to each other and the things that they're saying about each other. It was very, very different.
Sounds like the U.S. could learn something
Yeah,
from our neighbors
definitely.
to the south. I guess speaking of oil, that's a good segue. Although the energy sector is the largest source of global greenhouse gas emissions, generating our food is still a significant contributor. And depending on, what you include in food production, whether you include sort of the direct emissions that people think of kind of on the farm or, the greater supply chain, you can be looking at anywhere from 15 to 25% of our global emissions. So while fossil fuels rightfully, gets the majority of the focus, agriculture is still ripe with opportunity when it comes to, cutting emissions.
Mhm.
And I think the thing that sort of further underscores it is we're not set to be producing less food in the world. I mean, population's continuing to grow. We just hit 8 billion the other day, which is, in many ways a scary milestone, but food production is forecast to increase between 2009 and 2050 by almost 70%. And so naturally more food results in more emissions, and the World Resources Institute had this interesting piece where they looked at sort of the two paths we could take, and you know, taking kind of a path of no action, which is kind of where we are today, could result in a 60% increase in the greenhouse gas emissions from the food sector versus a, more ambitious path that would result in only about a 5%, I think they said 6% increase in greenhouse gas emissions. So either way, just producing the additional volume of food that we need is going to result in more greenhouse gases, but we clearly have an important decision to make there. So before we get into the discussion of solutions, I thought it might be interesting to kind of talk for a minute about different ways we can break down emissions, from our food. One way that a lot of folks kind of look at it is through this lens of the end product. So we've got, like animal-based food, meat and dairy, uh, which accounts for about 60% of global emissions, plant-based food, about 30%, and then, non-food uses within agriculture, things like cotton or rubber at about 10%. Another way you can slice it, as we look through these different analyses, is kind of the source of the emissions. So, for instance, we have change in land use, right? I think we talked about many times on this podcast the problem of deforestation being driven by more land clearing, and land use change is actually the biggest single bucket when it comes to our food production at about 40%. Then secondary to that are the emissions from, the farmland directly at about 30%. It's like soil disturbance, fertilizer, burning crop residues, et cetera. And then really the third kind of big bucket is I kind of call like direct livestock emissions, right? The things from the cows, goats, sheep, which primarily in this case is, what's called enteric fermentation. So cow burps. Anyway, just some different ways to think about the emissions that come from our food, how you can dice those up. But let's pivot to, I guess, the actual solution side. And let's start maybe first, Thomas, with the dirt and what we can do to reduce the amount of carbon that we're releasing from our soils, and and even pivot it in a different direction where it has the potential to be partially a solution.
Yeah, I think the soils have a role to play in the mitigation of climate change through carbon storage, but it's important to understand that not all carbon is equal in the role of sequestration and soil carbon storage, for the reasons that some carbon can be very mobile still in terms of organic carbon. The moment you have a drought, all that carbon that you've sequestered over the last 4 or 5 years might be then released back into the atmosphere. Or you have a bushfire and it takes out a bunch of agricultural land, and that then causes the carbon under the ground to break down as well. It's not really until the carbon is converted into mineralized carbon forms through microbial degradation that it becomes more permanent, that it's much more difficult for it to break down over time, and it can be locked up for thousands of years or indefinitely. So we've just got to keep that in mind and be very cognizant that we don't end up using it as an excuse to keep sucking fossil fuels out of the ground and burning them because we think we're locking carbon up somewhere else, when really it's only semi-permanent in many situations.
In other words, if I'm understanding you right, we've got the carbon that we can all sort of visualize that gets put into the soil by plant roots and and things like that. But those eventually decompose, and and with it, a lot of that goes back into the atmosphere potentially. And so it's only when it really moves into this mineralized form that it's kind of like stable, if you will.
Correct. Yeah, but it's not to say that having soil organic carbon is not a good thing. It is. It's a fantastic thing. It really helps with productivity of the agricultural land in general. Because organic carbon acts as a great big sponge. So it's phenomenally amazing at being able to store water so that the soil doesn't dry out or the water just doesn't run off into the rivers and flow out to the sea as soon as there's any rainfall. It stores that carbon that then it stores that moisture that then becomes accessible to the plants during dry periods. And of course, with increased fluctuations in the climate that we're going to see during these because of climate change, having that water storage capacity in the soil is, of course, a really good thing. It also creates a habitat, so to speak, for microbes, which allow the release of nutrients to plants to improve crop yields and so forth. So there's a multitude of benefits. A third one is, of course, the filtration capabilities and the fact that it then makes the water that ends up in the creeks and rivers and groundwater stores much cleaner because the soil carbon has been able to basically filter out contaminants. So, there's a multitude of benefits from having it, even if it's not locked up in terms of mineralized carbon.
So beneficial regardless and beneficial on a lot of levels. What sort of things, for those who might not be familiar, what sort of things, would need to occur on a farm that, let's say, doesn't have a lot of carbon in its soil and wants to increase the amount of soil carbon? What sort of practices would help with that?
Yeah, so I mean, basically, ever since the mechanization of agriculture, we've become really good at tilling soils. Preparing the soil so that we've got a really nice seed bed to allow rapid germination of crops, and then in modern agriculture, we then go about dumping a whole bunch of fertilizers, almost treating soil now like a hydroponic type scenario where we add the water, we add the nutrients, and we get the plants to grow. So moving away from that and back towards more perennial crops that are deep rooted, that allow you to sequester the carbon over a longer period of time at much deeper depths is probably where we need to pivot. However, it's not easy to achieve this without significantly changing practices from what we do today.
But at a macro level, it sounds like some of those practices are, minimizing the amount of tillage that we do. If there are perennial varieties of a crop, utilizing those, utilizing things, like cover crops that can push additional organic matter into the soil. But it's not a silver bullet. It sounds like.
No, but we have to do it if we want to make agriculture sustainable. So what we're doing right now, I mean, it's clearly not just from an emissions perspective, but just degradation of the soil. Like right now, we're talking decades left of doing what we're doing today to have depleted the soils to the point where they're basically unviable for what we're doing. So yeah, I mean things have to change, but it's going to be difficult to do that and and maintain the yields that we're achieving at the moment. But it's entirely possible. But yeah, it's not easy.
So Thomas, it sounds like, and I know we've talked about this before, lots of opportunity to make our soils healthier, which not only is good for the climate, but ultimately makes for a more sustainable food system. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about sort of the fertility side. I mean, most folks I think know that there are these chemical-based fertilizers that you can put down to give the plants nutrients, but wonder if you can talk about the problematic side from a carbon perspective.
Yeah, so I mean, from a carbon perspective, the biggest problem child in that department is undoubtedly ammonia-based fertilizers. So right now, they're predominantly made from natural gas, right, from fossil gas, and they have historically been quite inexpensive and subsequently abused. So in the past, you used to you need nitrogen in a plant to be able to build cell structures, right? And historically, because the atmosphere is 70% nitrogen, that was fixed into the soil by certain plant species, clovers and other legumes, that then make it available to grasses and other plants in the soil that maybe aren't so good at fixing nitrogen out of the air. They might be good at photosynthesizing and taking carbon out of the air or carbon dioxide out of the air, but they still need this nitrogen for the cell structures. But what we've done in recent years is become really good at making these ammonia based fertilizers, which contain that nitrogen, and pumping that into the soil, or distributing it in granulated form, so that we don't have to go and grow those complementary plant species. But of course, recently, as the oil price has gone through the roof because of the war in Ukraine, it's forced up massively the price of ammonia based fertilizers. And that is kind of a good thing in a way, because all of a sudden, all these farmers that really have been abusing it because it's just been so cheap, and using it on things such as pastures, rather than growing clovers in their pastures, they just grow all ryegrass and just pump the ammonia based fertilizers in to supply the nitrogen to the plant. Now they're moving away from that and going back towards having a mixed species pasture, which is far more sustainable, and of course has a much lower uh, level of carbon emissions.
Well, and then it turns out also when you put too much of it on, it ends up in our river systems. It releases nitrous oxide into the atmosphere, which is a big carbon pollutant. So Todd, we've been taking all the air in the room here, and there's obviously another big category that I mentioned earlier that's important, which is you know the emissions related to meat and dairy production, and clearly soils are a part of that, but there are other pieces, right? So, wondering if you could talk about sort of the sources of emissions when we're talking about creating those animal-based proteins, and what kind of solutions we have available to us to address them.
Yeah, I want to know why you make me follow Thomas. I feel like I'm back in school again. Class clown over here screwing around, and all of a sudden I gotta follow smartest guy in the class.
We can
They'll
switch the
make me
order next
stand in
time.
a trash can again. I had to do that when I was in second grade. My teacher made me stand in a trash can, and because I was laughing so loud, and she made me just continue laughing as I stood in a trash can. That was my punishment.
Well, don't sell yourself short. I know you can speak to this because as folks may not know, you came or grew up in a ranching community. You had some cattle on your property at home. So I,
Yeah.
I trust you. I trust you can speak to this even if it's hard to follow, Mr. Mills.
Well, I kind of grew up, yeah, definitely at a small level, in the cattle world, but definitely around that culture, right? In kind of researching this thing, not to be too dire, but it is. I want to reiterate the fact that obviously the biggest thing any of us could do, or anybody out there listening could do, is repeat kind of what we had in the first episode, and that's if you want to do something to reduce your impact, like one of the biggest things you can do is just eat less meat, and specifically just eat less beef. If you're a big beef eater and you cut that down, it's like driving an electric car. I mean, it's a huge, huge impact. Emissions from livestock account for about 14.5% of total greenhouse gas emissions globally, right? And 2/3 of that come from cattle. So that's kind of the numbers you're looking at. So when it feels like I pick on beef, I don't mean to, but it's kind of deserving. I like it. It's good. It tastes good, right? Don't get me wrong, but it's a huge impact. It's so big that there's some research out there that shows that the five largest meat and dairy corporations combined, and that's JBS, Tyson, Cargill, Dairy Farmers of America, and Frontera, are responsible for more annual greenhouse gas emissions than ExxonMobil by itself, Shell, or BP. Um,
Wow.
that's that's significant, right? I mean, it's a significant chunk. But for the solution side, and some of this is really directly related to some of the stuff Thomas was talking about, there's some research that shows you can have a 46% reduction in net greenhouse gas emissions per unit of beef if you kind of initiated carbon sequestration management strategy on grazed lands. So that's like organic soil amendments, restoring trees, vegetation, kind of just moving away from that kind of scorched earth policy that I think has happened a lot in the past with the grazing of animals, in forest and woodlands, right? Riverbanks, I remember growing up, riparian zones was a huge thing in the impact, and basically a lot of the land use organizations were basically having ranchers fence off, a lot of those riparian zones. And I'm sure it was a pain in the ass and it's a lot of work, but it has like significant impact.
So in a way, if people were, kind of visualizing this, instead of kind of that, quintessential white fenced pasture with just grass, we're looking at something that is more natural then. So, achieving these kind of reductions means putting trees back out there, putting natural, other natural vegetation, and as you said,
Sure.
making sure that our riverbanks have vegetation on them again rather than having it just be grass all the way down to the water.
Yeah, and I've been reading some articles that were maybe a little misleading that were kind of pro beef, right? And they kind of made it sound like on these grazed lands and some of these pasture lands, right, that the cattle were essential to like maintaining the life of these lands. And I'm kind of thinking like, well, I'm sure you can limit the impact, but I'm guessing those lands probably did pretty well before we ever got here and put cows on them. You know what I mean? It was kind of like it was kind of like that, well, those hills aren't going to graze themselves, kind of
Yeah.
mentality, and it's like I don't know about that, that's a little bit of a stretch, right? And there's also that argument, and there's probably some validity to this, that there's some of these lands that cattle are grazing on that you're not going to put farm ground on anyway. You couldn't do a lot else with it. But I don't know if it's making up for the methane, right? You know what I mean? Like I couldn't tell you that not farming that land wouldn't make up for the net loss of the methane gas that's getting produced.
Well, I read in that World Resources Institute article I was mentioning earlier that, the reality is it's not that, there weren't always animals out there, like a cattle equivalent, but there were just so much fewer, right? The
Yeah,
article talked about, there's 70 billion animals a year that are, quote, harvested for human food. And that's vastly larger than, what would have been in the natural ecosystem. So,
sure.
it's not having a few, elk and deer out there as a problem. It's the fact that we just have the numbers are so out of balance with what was there, before we came along. And I mean, you already touched on it, Todd. I think, you know, it we have all of these, good and getting better every day meat alternatives. And it's not to say that you can't have that, that piece of red meat every now and again, but because cattle are so inefficient at converting, that grain into meat, and they belch all this methane along the way, it becomes extremely carbon intensive.
Yeah.
There's, we've talked about in our other episodes on meat, you're talking, with the methane included, on the order of 30 to 50 times the carbon emissions equivalent of, a protein source like a black bean.
Yeah, one of the other things too that seemed promising was it's basically they harness the what they call cow poo power, which is really the in these dairies, and they have these catchment ponds for the waste, and they take that material and they basically harness it and use it, burn the gas off of it to generate power. And I'm just curious as to what your thoughts are on that
Yeah.
process.
Yeah, look, I think it's a great solution. I mean, we all know that we're going to have to replace fossilized natural gas with some other source for those high temperature applications we have in society. So covering these settling ponds, capturing the gas, it's a two-win situation, because it's not just that you've been able to do something with it, either generate electricity or use it for making green steel, etc., but you've also saved the methane from being released. And instead, you're combusting it and you're releasing the methane as carbon dioxide and water vapor.
So, as we're talking about these different, solutions that exist to make our food, more climate friendly, I think we'd be remiss if we talk about something that's not directly associated with food production, but has a very big carbon footprint, and that's the waste on the back end. Because the reality is, if we waste less food, we don't need to grow as much food, and we have less emissions. And it's estimated that nearly a third of the food that gets produced never reaches, the kitchen table. And in the case of the US, it's upwards of 40%. And so, when you look at that in terms of the food that's wasted and then the emissions as that food breaks down, because it too releases methane when it decomposes, you're talking about 8 to 10% of global emissions associated with effectively our food waste. Now, there are huge opportunities to reduce those numbers and ensure that we're making use of what we're growing. And not only does that enable us to grow less food and create less emissions, but it also takes some of the pressure off wanting to clear more land for agriculture and reducing some of that deforestation, which is ultimately one of the biggest pieces of the puzzle when it comes to ag emissions.
It's outrageous to think that we waste that much food. I
It
I
really
I
is.
I don't get it.
Well, I mean, honestly, what we really probably need to do, and you're teeing us up for here, Todd, is we need to come back and talk about, food waste, as a whole episode, because I think it really, it merits that kind of focus given, um, you know, not only the climate side, but the fact that we have people going hungry in the world, and yet we're wasting roughly a third of our food. So, yeah, I think definitely opportunity to dig into it more.
Yeah.
you know, Kind of stepping back, be definitely thrown a lot at you. I think the key messages in my mind are, food is a significant part of our emissions, but that there's big opportunity to be able to reduce those emissions by, you know, removing the fossil fuels that are part of our food system, returning these ecosystems to the extent that we can back to a healthier state, whether it's, you know, trees and shrubs on pasture land or healthier soils, and, and trying to, where we can, eat lower on the food chain, halt deforestation, and avoid waste. So, yes, it's a big chunk of emissions, but there's, whether we go with a carbon price, uh, or other combinations of incentives and penalties, there's a big chance for us to, close the gap that we need to and hit climate targets by tackling these food-based emissions. Any additional thoughts, gentlemen?
No, I think that sums it up well. I mean, I would like to ask for tighter regulations around land clearing because basically the more land we clear, the cheaper we make food, and the more that allows a population growth, which then puts more pressure on the land. So ultimately, we really need to tighten up the regulations around land clearing and around the use of fossil fuels and other things in agriculture in general because if we don't get a grasp on this, we're just driving ourselves off the cliff.
On that optimistic note, Thomas, it's like you knew what we had in here for our call to action, which for today is supporting the Forests Act, which is an act here in the U.S. Congress that stands for, and you'll love this acronym, Fostering Overseas Rule of Law and Environmentally Sound Trade. And but what it does in a much simpler sense is it restricts the products that get produced by clearing land, by clearing forests from entering the US. So, these very things you're talking about, Thomas, whether it's, beef in Brazil that's being produced because they've cleared Amazon rainforest, or, palm oil from, Indonesia by cutting down rainforests there. The intent is to, with this act, prevent those commodities from coming into the US, because let's face it, we're the biggest market for this stuff. So, if we
Hmm.
can do a better job of doing our due diligence and buying from, areas that we know are sustainable, it's not going to solve the problem, but it definitely goes a long way. So we'll have a link on our website to a petition to, call for the Forest Act to be passed, but encourage folks to check it out because, it does have bipartisan support, and who knows, maybe it's one of those, things that we could actually get passed in this next Congress. So that's a wrap for this week's episode. Thanks to everybody for tuning in. Come join us again on December 13th when we'll be releasing our next episode on sustainable building in the residential space. Climate Optimists is made possible by Climate Stewards Collective. You can find us on the web at climateoptimist.co, and don't forget to follow us on social at Climate Optimist Podcast.